Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the only artist talk of this fall. We've had a really busy fall here at Concord Art. It's part of the reason why this will be our only artist talk for this season. And most recently, we've been kept quite busy installing and opening the faculty show, which shows 50 artists who have taught at Concord Art and who have contributed to our educational programs. And we opened it on Saturday. So if you attended, we loved to see you. We had a great time being able to see you all in person. And if you haven't seen the show, come on over anytime. The faculty show, it'll be up through December. It's a great show. Definitely come see it in person. We have some other events coming up that have been keeping us very busy. Next week, one of our favorite events to produce with our collaborator, Fugitive Productions, and David Garrett returns. True Stories Told Live is going to be in person and online. So we're telling stories from the classroom in conjunction with our celebration of teachers. We have 8 amazing storytellers who are going to be sharing their true stories. So you can buy tickets to online, you can buy tickets to in person. So whether you join us in the building or from home, we do hope that you will join us. It's going to be a great night. We're also opening the postcard show, formerly known as the Great Big Work Show, the 5x7 show, opens on December 2nd with the opening sale. We're still accepting donations through the end of November. November 30th is the deadline. Any 5x7 substrate is welcome, and anyone is welcome to donate. You don't have to be a member or involved with us in any way beyond your donation if you don't want to be. So we would love to see your work and have your contribution to the show. And last but not least, I'm going to quickly plug our faculty show fundraiser, Buy an Apple for the Teachers. This fundraiser has some great prizes attached to it that you will be eligible for at the end of the faculty show. Every ticket purchase gives you chances to win free classes or workshops, or even be a part of a group studio visit to the Marking Lives founder, Liz Awalt, to her Concord studio. So check that out as well. Our brand new assistant director, Natalie Reiser, is going to be sharing links in our chat box to all of these events and fundraisers. So if you want to learn more, you can use those links to go right to our website, and you can find out how to donate or register or what have you. So now I would like to introduce the one and only Wilhelm Neusser. It's been a real joy for us at Concord Art to get to know Wilhelm over this last year that we've been working together. We're really excited to have him here tonight. Wilhelm was born in Cologne, Germany, and now lives in Somerville, Massachusetts, where his studio is. He's represented by Abigail Ogilvy Gallery in Boston, and he has a new show opening in Germany, a few new shows opening in Germany this month. I've been a big fan of Wilhelm unknowingly for many years when I saw his work at Mass Mocha, the Into the Dark, the Lure of the Dark show a few years ago. So I'm really excited for him to come and speak with us tonight. And without any further delay, I'm going to welcome Wilhelm Neusser. Oh, and one more thing, just before we start, just a reminder, we're going to do chat questions tonight. So if you have questions for Wilhelm that bubble up throughout the talk, just put them in the chat and we're going to make note of all those questions. And at the end, we'll have a formal conversation period with Wilhelm. So if anything comes up, don't be shy, throw it in the chat. We're going to get to it later. Great, so here for you all is Wilhelm Neusser.
Thank you so much, Marissa. Thank you guys for joining us tonight. Thanks to Concord Art for having me tonight. I hope you can all hear me. You see me here in my studio in Somerville. And yeah, welcome all. I won't waste a lot of time and I will jump right in because we have to cover a lot of information. In this talk, I will show some of my own work and many examples of other artists, mostly painters from different time periods. I do this following in a specific idea. I want to focus on the pictorial space as announced in the advertisement, especially on the top layer, the foreground. This talk wants to be and wants to provide food for thought. So I hope you're really hungry. And please understand this food as takeout. I want you to take it home and to your studios and devour and hopefully increase your appetite for more art. A couple of disclaimers at the beginning. Despite the poster you're seeing on the screen right now at the beginning of the slideshow, despite the poster, we will not talk cranberries tonight. So I have to disappoint you right at the beginning, no cranberry paintings, but a lot of other good stuff, I promise. All paintings that are not mine in this slideshow are either photos I took from originals or out of books. So sometimes you might see that the picture looks a little warped, but that's only because it photographed right out of a book and the page wasn't sitting flat. Many of the images are taken straight from the internet. And you will see that the only information that I provide with the individual images is the name of the artist. No further information on the piece, size, material, because I want you to focus on the picture and not waste your time in the caption. All right, so let's get started. I take you back 1 year to Abigail Ogilvy Gallery. That's our first slide. We'll start here. It was last fall, Abigail Ogilvy Gallery in Boston, where I had a show titled The Sixth Season. While creating the work for the show during the pandemic summer of 2020, I got interested in compositional elements that populate the foreground and, to some extent, block the view into the distance. Next slide. I was trying to emphasize the layer of the pictorial.
Oh. Wilhelm, can you repeat that and go back? You were unmuted for a minute. It might have been something I hit by accident.
Sorry, I see that's weird. Okay. To some extent, block the view into the distance. I was trying to emphasize the layer of the pictorial space that's the closest to the viewer, the closest to us as the viewer. In one group of paintings, these elements were branches of Forsythia, and behind me, you probably saw that there's some more recent versions of that same painting. In another body of work, it was chain link fences. Next slide, please. Here's an example of the chain link fence in the foreground. I wanted to find out how the pictorial foreground interacts with the other layers, middle and background, while everything was happening on the same surface of the canvas. Next slide. In the chain link paintings, I scratched the diamond-shaped pattern into the wet paint and kept working and painting on top, like the picnic blanket here in the lower left that gave the painting its title. It's positioned right against the fence and that separates us from the lake, the body of water, the shore. The whole series was inspired by Fresh Pond. And I was wondering, like, where are we as the viewer? So the fence is kind of cutting us out of the picture. Marissa, maybe we can go back one slide to see the entire picture one more time. Yep, there we go. So where are we? You know, we're front of the fence. Maybe we're sitting on the picnic blanket, right? But we're all kind of kept out of the vista, kept out of the depths of the pictorial space. So that's exactly the area I am interested in. It's like between pretty much the foreground and the viewer. And this is pretty much what this talk will be about. And if we go further now to the fence with the signs on them. So I kept thinking about the fence as a divider that does not make the landscape behind it invisible, but it forms a visual interference, definitely a symbolic one. I saw a push and pull effect. The beholder is pulled into the depths of the landscape following a traditional reading of the painting and pushed back out by the fence. Next slide. In other paintings, In another painting, that is building on my experience with the dripped cranberries, I created a curtain of snow over the Boston skyline, drips of paint on the surface of the canvas. And I wondered where they are in the pictorial order. Does it feel like we are in the snow? Are we in front of the curtain of snow and it's just above the city? So again, I was interested in what's happening between us, the kind of top layer, the foreground of the pictorial space, and the rest of the depths of the painting. Next slide. Oh, here's a detail of the dripped snow curtain, so to speak, a close-up of. For an upcoming show in Germany that Marissa mentioned, I painted a group of 6 pool paintings, swimming pools behind fences at night, titled Night Swim. And in these pictures, the fence holds us back from the luxurious and refreshing experience of a night dive, midnight dive. But looking up close, you'll notice that someone cut open the fence, pushed it aside, and probably already made their way towards the pool. So again, playing with the fence as this visual interference between us and the landscape, in this case also with the symbolic meaning of being kept out, being kept away potentially from this luxurious experience. But then again, cutting into the fence, finding your way to it anyways. My thoughts about the pictorial space, the illusional depths, reminded me of a painting that was exhibited in 2019 at the Fruitlands Museum, Harvard, Massachusetts. And you see here the gallery space at the Fruitlands, which probably a lot of you have visited in person. I had the opportunity to sneak in a few of my works into the museum's stunning collection of Hudson River School paintings, creating an intergenerational dialogue, I want to call it, on landscape painting. In the next slide, you see my painting in the middle on the left, right next to a beautiful Albert Bierstedt panorama. And if we get a little closer to my work, you will notice the rich texture. The next slide shows that. A big chunk of oil paint in the upper section. And the next slide. A big chunk of paint in the upper left-hand corner of the painting. Scratches into the wet paint, similar to what we saw happening with the fences. And then a layer of dark blue pushed over the surface in the lower right. In the next slide, we go even closer. It is this blurb of paint that I'm looking at now. It sits so crisp on the surface, and it is in contrast to the blurred depiction of the distance. But where is it? Where is it in the construction of the painting, of the pictorial space? I am reminded of the view through a dirty window, or even bird poop on a car's windshield. Can we focus on both the bird poop and the horizon at the same time? They are on the same surface. I will go back even further into the year 2008. At the time, I was, oh, here, sorry, that's another overview of the painting we just looked at. At the time, I was living in Cologne, Germany. I came to the US in 2011. So 2008 in Cologne, I painted a series of wall paintings, brick walls. Already at the time, I was interested in a pictorial space that denies itself as much as possible. Yes, there are indications of depths. Let's go to the next slide that shows you the entire series of the wall paintings. There are indications of depths, like shadows around the windows, for example, or within the windows, I should say. But they are as reduced as possible. Limited access. As viewers, we're kept out of these paintings on the outside. We're literal outsiders. Even the windows do not allow us visual access. They seem like blind eyes. At this point in my presentation, I'll leave my own studio and take a look together with you at other examples. While my wall paintings made us to outsiders, denying the view inside, a more common and more inviting formula is looking from the inside out, an open window looking into the landscape. Nope, we stay with Beckmann, please. 1 sec. Thank you. Traditionally, paintings are compared to windows, and this idea is doubled in paintings of windows. The architectural element of the window's opening or frame functions as a so-called repoussoir, French for pushing back. A foreground element that brackets or frames the view normally on one or both sides, and thereby leads the view into the distance and emphasizes the depths of the pictorial space. It also positions us as the viewer by mediating between the reality of the depicted scene and our reality in front of the painting. Going back in the history of art, we find out that this idea is not new. Artists of previous centuries knew how to make good use of this pictorial strategy. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. They created complex foreground compositions, multiple layers of repoussoir, guiding our eye. Next slide. Jesus aside, so to speak, guiding our light into an infinite distance. As landscape painters, we recognize rules of perspective at work here, especially color perspective, creating the illusion of atmosphere from warmer colors, browns and reds, via greens to cooler and lighter blues in the far distance. Next slide. Painting benefited a huge deal from the knowledge of photography, and as painters, we apply this optical knowledge to our work. Like, for example, in the next slide, like Kenton Nelson's beach scene, where the sharp and crisp outline of the figure in the foreground contrasts with the blurred figures in the distance and the hazy horizon line, thereby organizing the pictorial space. And in the next slide, I think I could argue a little bit of that, maybe not as figurative and explicit, I can find in my own work as well. Crisp versus the blurry as a way to organize the foreground versus the distance. Next slide. A painter who I looked at a lot throughout my own career is Gerhard Richter, or Gerhard Richter in German. His earth seems like an endless source of information and inspiration. I'm showing you this early painting of his because I want to bring us back to the foreground. While Jan van Eyck sent our eye beyond the Chancellor Roland and baby Jesus into the far distance, Richter in his painting here keeps our eye trapped in the foreground. We recognize a grid that references a window, like in Beckmann or Matisse, we saw those earlier. But looking through it, it seems we only enter a few inches before hitting a wall, indicated by the shadows of the grid. And Richter's painting here is a great example for what I'm looking for in my talk today. Maybe it should not be titled the talk, Limited Access, but Limited Depths. These examples that, the examples that follow will all allow us access. They do lure us in, but not into a far distance. They keep us in the foreground on the surface of the painting. Next slide, please. A contemporary of Gerhard Richter is Sigmar Polke. And I have to say, both of these were artists that I admired very early on as a teenager when I got interested in art and painting, and they haven't lost any of their appeal. Sigmar Polke, both of them actually worked in Cologne, so that's another connection. He found other ways of challenging and deconstructing the illusion of the pictorial space. Working with clear resin on transparent or translucent fabrics, he turned the canvas into a literal glass-like window pane, exploring the construction of the stretcher, exposing the construction of the stretcher, showing the real wall on which the painting is hanging. We are literally hitting a wall, end of illusion. And I want to point out the painting on the right here has a sentence or a phrase written in the center in mirror reverse. It says, Die Dinge sehen, wie sie sind. That's German, and it translates as seeing the things the way they are. So in a very beautiful and smart way, he's like tricking us more than once in this painting. So, you know, if you read the sentence, it's all about seeing things the right way, but he presents the sentence mirror reverse. You could argue, if you would read it the right way, is the painting maybe hanging the wrong way? Hard to tell, but then the stretcher is the classical underconstruction of a canvas, but it's not hidden, it's exposed. It's exposed. And I also like this kind of clumsy drawing on there of like stacked blocks, which, you know, seems to try some kind of perspectival trick, but it's, yeah, it seems to fail. And the whole painting is about this deconstructing the illusion of the pictorial space. Still love these paintings. Next slide, please. We're still in Cologne, Germany, my hometown, where I, from 2000 to 2010, as a side job, worked as an art handler at an art auction house. I loved this job because I had the chance to see so many great artworks close up. There are two paintings by Luca Fontana that were sold off around that time. And I remember installing the pink painting on the left at a preview in Munich. And I had the chance to inspect Fontana's work close up. You can see a thick layer of pink oil paint surrounding the center hole. What struck me at the time was the dark black fabric that was stretched on the back of the stretcher, forming the backdrop for the dramatic opening in the front of the canvas. Unlike Polke, we do not see the actual wall. Unlike in Richter's window grid, we see not a painted, but we do see a real shadow in there of the foreground on the backdrop. So again, there is an interesting idea in this Fontana painting about the pictorial space, because it seems to be there in a very physical sense between the painted layer on top and the stretched gauze, black fabric in the back. And the shadow that we see in this picture kind of brings them together in this shallow pictorial space of that painting. Cutting into the canvas is a thing. When paintings are a world of illusion, cutting into them means deconstruction of illusion. We could play on a famous Guns N' Roses album title and say, this is about losing your illusion. In the next slide, we see work by Titus Khafar, and he is taking apart the illusion of white art, white art history, by pointing out the presence and role of Black servants and slaves. He brings their untold stories to the foreground. This piece here, so it seems to me, makes visible a figure that, indicated by the position of the canvas, was meant not to be seen. The canvas, you know, is facing the wall. We still have trouble seeing her, or the figure, I think it's a her, since the figure is upside down. But what we do see clearly is the figure's white shadow, the negative space, an emptiness, a void. We see what's not there. And that brings us to the thought of visibility. Since the foreground is in front of whatever is behind it, it can frame it, it can block it, it can let us peek through. The foreground determines visibility. Well, since he's in town right now, let's ask Titian. I'm sure you all have seen the beautiful show at the Isabella Stewart Garden Museum. If not, a must. We've got here the portrait of Cardinal Filippo Arcinto. My Italian does not exist. Portrait of Cardinal Filippo Arcinto. And I want to argue that the curtain or veil, here's another disclaimer. As you know by now, I'm German. I live in the US for 10 years, but I still have some pronunciation issues sometimes. So when I say whale from now on, I'm not talking about a giant sea mammal. I'm talking about a curtain. Thank you. I want to argue that the veil in this painting makes the portrait less and more visible at the same time. We try to see through the foreground to recognize more. We are attracted by the fact that there's something in the way. We're attracted that, we can't get straight through to the sitter, to the protagonist. In comparison, next slide, please, the same cardinal by the same painter without the veil almost seems a little boring. Next slide. So if you like the cardinal with the veil in front, you have to go, and you want to see it in person, you have to go to Philadelphia. And if you like the cardinal without the veil, you have to go to the Metropolitan Museum in New York. If you like a Titian Pope as a veil, next slide, please, you can't stay home because it will ship to you in 2 to 3 business days for exactly $61. This shower curtain definitely makes a great eye catcher in everyone's bathroom. Couldn't resist to show you that. Back to visibility. Another example for increasing visibility, someone has to pick up the phone. Another example for increasing visibility of things through kind of wrapping or covering them is, of course, the work of Christo and Jean-Claude, as recently executed and realized here in Paris, posthumously after 40 years of planning. And I'm sure you saw pictures online of this amazing installation. Coming from Germany, we remember the wrapping of the Reichstag and now the German Parliament. And it's a fascinating idea. By kind of temporarily hiding them under a cover, they become even more visible and draw even more attention. Back to painting. In the next slide, we see Peter Doig's work. And Peter Doig created many landscapes in which he investigates the relationship between the foreground and the distance. These paintings are for real pathfinders. Our eyes have to find their way. They have to blaze a trail through the thicket. While Titian covers his cardinal with a literal veil, Doig pulls a curtain of branches and leaves in front of, in this case here, Le Corbusier's architecture in the left-hand picture. So what is it about curtains that seems so attractive to painters? Well, this is literally an old story going back to a painting competition in antiquity between 2 painters, Zeuxis and Parrhasius. When Zeuxis unveiled his painting of grapes, they appeared so real that birds flew down to peck at them. Then Parrhasius, whose painting was concealed behind a curtain, asked Zeuxis to pull aside that curtain. The curtain itself turned out to be a painted illusion. While Richter, Fontana, Polke, Khafar showed us how to deconstruct the illusional sphere of painting, we're now looking into the work of artists who, can't read my handwriting, tried to heighten, no, go ahead, good, to try to heighten the illusion. We already talked about the foreground as the kind of mediating level between the pictorial space and our space as the beholders. And here Rembrandt offers us a view into a dark interior after a curtain was pulled aside. This curtain is not in the space of the interior, it's attached to the painting's frame. But wait, the frame is painted as well, and so is the curtain. So they belong into the painting, but they're not part of the interior depicted. These foreground elements, they're coming towards us into our space as the beholder, and it does not take a lot to imagine that we were the ones that pulled the curtain aside. In a way, this is a real interactive painting. It connects us with the depths of the interior via the layer of the foreground, via the curtain. In the next slide, we get to know Gerhard Richter, one of Rembrandt's most prolific and successful students. And you might know a picture of a sleeping dog in the MFA in Boston that came to the collection a few years ago through the Van Otterlo collection. That's a beautiful Gerhard Richter painting. And he is known for his incredible virtuosity. And you see a similar strategy at work here. There is a guy with his pipe leaning in this kind of arched window with a book that's leaning over the windowsill into our space. But on top of that, there's another layer of the curtain. And you can see, and that's why I put this on a white background, this slide. The curtain is literally like attached to the painted frame within the painting. So you wonder, would you actually frame a painting like that? I don't know. I guess we have to go to Holland, to the Netherlands to find out. Well, fabrics and textiles, we also can find in sculpture, like in this amazing sculpture of a veiled Christ by Giuseppe Martino. You'll find that sculpture in Naples. The veil here is mediating as well between the body of Christ and our sphere. It is so meticulously, so beautifully carved that we have trouble believing that this is just a piece of rock, a piece of marble. Next slide is a detail. Instead, we might believe that this is the real Christ, maybe petrified. So it's so well done, it makes you a believer. Reality and illusion melt together. I would say this is augmented reality of the Baroque, AR 1700. Next slide, please. We're back in the 20th century and back to Gerhard Richter. He painted a whole series of curtain paintings playing with the illusional qualities of that theme. So we can see how this motif, survived hundreds and hundreds of years. And I want to point out in this piece by Richter here, this very thin black line on the bottom, marking the end of the curtain, indicating a space behind it. We mentioned the terms illusion and illusional space multiple times. That, of course, brings us to the category in painting that you all know, and that is famous for painterly virtuosity, the trompe-l'oeil. Next slide, please. Trompe-l'oeil is French for deceiving the eye. Trompe-l'oeil painter's goal is pretty much to make the two-dimensional sphere of the canvas look like a three-dimensional one, in which objects look real. Rembrandt's and Dou's curtains were already pointing in this direction. Other painters, especially still life painters, pushed this genre towards the incredible, or I should probably say the credible mastery. Pushed this genre towards incredible or credible mastery. The next slide shows a painting by Louis-Leopold Wally at the Clark in Williamstown. You might have seen it there, noticed it there. And Boilly makes the surface of the canvas look like an actual stretch of wall in which a scissor, letters, other objects are attached. And what I thought is funny here, notice that in this piece, the frame is not painted, as you can tell by the shadow the frame casts on the wall. So again, that's an interesting question. As soon as there's a painted frame in there, can you still add another real frame around it? Interesting thing to discuss. The next slide brings us to a famous painting by an artist called Gijsbrecht. So we're back to the Dutch Golden Age. And he turns things upside down, or better, back to front. The behind of this scene becomes here center stage. The verso of a canvas becomes the protagonist, celebrating illusional depths in form of a shallow foreground. So as I said earlier, depths, yes, we get a good sense of the depths of the frame and the depths of the stretcher before our eye hits pretty much the linen, right? And I thought it would be really cool if the linen would be the actual linen of the canvas. I couldn't find out if that's the case in this painting. This thought and genre is not out of fashion at all. So I want to introduce to you 3 painters from Boston, from the Boston area, whose work relates to our conversation, to our theme. We're going to start with Caitlin Ledford, and just as Gijsbrecht's several hundred years earlier, Caitlin turns things around in a fun and playful way, making the back of a canvas her motif on the front. So what we see here in her studio is actually the front of a painted either canvas or panel, I don't know, but she's pretty much depicting the rear of a canvas, and with this beautifully bent kind of crossbar, she adds a very playful moment to it. In the next slide, she shows a similar strategy. In these 2 examples with lots of playful details, which is a real showpiece of her virtuosity. I'll give you a moment to take all this in. Especially the painting on the right fascinates, since Ledford here, she depicts the very rear of the birch plywood panel she paints on. That painted cross brace most likely has its real mirror image right on the other side of the paneled surface. Mind-boggling even without all the additions. I honestly could have done without it, but note how, for example, the Shane, right painting lower half. Note how the Shane, through its shadow, is part of the pictorial space. While the angel with sword, upper right painting, upper left-hand corner, sits on top of the surface. And you see the difference? The chain is kind of introduced, implemented in pictorial space. You have a sense it's literally hanging in front of the plywood, while the angel feels much more like a cutout. So within this very shallow, narrow space, she creates all this variation. Before I introduce the second painter, we're going to have a quick look at our window into the landscape examples in the next slide. You remember Max Beckmann on the left and Henri Matisse on the right, the classic view through a window into the distance. It's a different story with the window paintings by Josephine Anderson. Next slide. And you might have seen these 2 at Mass Mocha, Marissa. They were also part of the show Lure in the Dark, and I have to say I was blown away by these paintings. If I recall the background story properly, Josephine Anderson attended a prestigious residency in Rome. From her studio window, or apartment window, she oversaw the Eternal City, depicted so many times throughout history. Not worth competing, Josephine decided, and started painting the view through the window, but at night. As an observational painter, next slide, please. As an observational painter, she scanned the same window night for night, registering subtle differences of light reflecting on the frame. And even the reappearing constellation of the stars shows. If you look up closely, you'll see, like in the middle of the dark area, right-hand side, close to the frames, a little white dot. And then if you go up to, like, let's say 11:30, there's another little white dot, and you see them repeated in both paintings. So that makes total sense. You know, she's looking every night at the same window, and yes, the stars would move over time, but you know, not from night to night. So they show up in the same area of the painting. One more thought about this. I'm fascinated with these paintings. How, on the one hand, no, I'm still fascinated with the paintings. How they're both. On the one hand, they're kind of an anti-window in a Malevich kind of sense, like the black square. So they're like a no window. And at the same time, they offer a view into the infinity of the universe. I thought that's really remarkable. These paintings have, without doubt, they have depth. The next slide brings us back from Rome to Massachusetts, where Josephine painted a series of observations she made while exploring the surroundings of her home in Western Massachusetts. And I like the term scanning the surface for her work and somewhat unemotional analysis of the top layer of her environment. And I'm showing you these two beautiful depictions of surface of birch trunks with those little stickers peeling off. Again, it's a very narrow foreground that she's defining here. The paintings have depths, but it's very shallow. So they fit in the group of works that we discussed today. The next painter I want to show to you is Julie Beck. She is an academically trained painter and educator at the Academy of Realist Art in Boston. And she's an expert, a true expert when it comes to optical illusions. In the painting on the right, a classic trompe-l'oeil, she samples Maurizio Cattelan's Banana, you heard about it, you saw it, with René Magritte's famous "This is not a pipe painting." And this might be a comment of a painter committed to tradition, playfully criticizing forms of gimmicky conceptualism. But let's take a look at the painting on the left with the graffiti. The graffiti in the painting, like Ledford's Angel with the Sword, the letters seem to sit on top of the canvas rather than being in the illusional space of the still life. The blue paint, the bright blue paint is dripping down and it floats behind the skull and thereby brings it in relation to the other objects. The drops are in front of the table and indicate how far this, and thereby indicate how far the skull is reaching out into our space. So even if the upper part of that tag, of that graffiti, looks like it's sitting on top of the still life, the drips change that assumption because they're kind of dripping kind of through the skull, but in front of the tablecloth. That means the skull is like pointing towards us, coming towards us into the space of the beholder. And text, I think, is a very interesting thing in general, because if you think about text and letters, where does text belong in our construction of the pictorial space? Do letters belong to another world? Are they of a different format? Do they sit flat on the surface, creating kind of openings or portals into other dimensions via the mind rather than the eye? Or can they be both? Can they be carriers of meaning and at the same time elements of the pictorial space? Well, I think they can be both. And I'll try to prove that in a couple of examples. The next slide shows this Japanese woodcut hero, Hiroshige. And we see those usual kind of text boxes with Japanese characters in it. And I feel like on the one hand, yes, they're sitting on top of the depiction. This is the famous, or one version of the famous depiction of a rainy day, famously picked up by Van Gogh. But see those cassettes, those little text boxes, they seem to sit on top. And then at the same time, if you look at them in more detail at the right, it almost feels like the red one is in front of the yellow green one that's kind of camouflaged. So they seem to somehow react to space, but they don't really feel like they're part of the landscape. So my question here would be, which space do you see them in? The next example is who? Oh, is a German painter, Neo Rauch. I'm sure you've heard of him. And he implements text in his paintings. Often the title of the painting finds itself integrated in the painting. The left-hand side painting is says Mars, the god of war, probably personified through this heroic figure with the blue jackets throwing a spear. But even the letter S in Mars is designed and depicted in a way that we could say it has something of a weapon or a spear or an arrow. So the way he treats the characters and the letters is much more painterly than just information. So here I would argue, to some extent, the letters left the surface and made it into the painting. The painting on the right, showing kind of a construction site situation, has in the middle ground this kind of container or box. And on it, it's a little hard to read, you'll see the German word Schicht, Schicht. And Schicht has two meanings. It can mean a layer, but it also can mean a shift, like a night shift, like part of a work schedule, the morning shift, night shift. So, but what's interesting here is the way it's foreshortened and kind of implemented into that kind of display on that container makes the text much more of an element in the distance, in the middle ground of the painting. So it doesn't feel like it's sitting on top. So in that sense, I think text can be in both worlds. It can be sit on top as information stimulating the mind, but it can also take on both, meaning plus pictorial meaning in terms of picture language. And the third and last example is, I think, Ruscha. You're familiar with his work. And again, we have this contrast of text sitting on top of the painting, pay nothing until April. It seems to sit in front of this snowy landscape, while Hollywood, in the way it's foreshortened, seems to be part of the pictorial space and much more an pictorial element than maybe purely graphic element. We're slowly coming to an end here. Let me sum up what we looked at. I shared some insights from my own studio and my own practice and work. We looked at the work of artists challenging, deconstructing, and breaking open the illusional space of the canvas, Polke, Fontana, Khafar. We unveiled the curtain. We looked out of windows, more or less far into the distance. We studied the trompe-l'oeil. And last but not least, we tried to locate word language within pictorial or picture language. So all of these are, considerations that are of interest to me and important to me. And, I carry these with me every day, and they kind of inform what I react to. So the next to this picture and the following one will show you that, with those thoughts in mind, I react to certain images like this one here, or this one. Yeah, please go ahead. The snapshot I took of the construction site here in Cambridge a while ago. So you can see all of what we discussed is in here. And all this, together I take to my studio, and that's where we're going to end then with the last picture. I'm going to take all of this to the studio and try to kind of bring it together in experiments, combining, the idea of the veil, the curtain, the interference, the distance behind it, the foreground in front of the foreground, and maybe even the element of text. Well, that was lots of food for thought, and lots to digest, but I promise you, it's a healthy diet for sure. I'll end here. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to questions if you have any.
Thank you, Wilhelm. That was awesome. A lot to think about, but we do have some questions ready to go. And as things bubble up, please continue using the chat. We're just at a few minutes of 7, so we can go right over. I know we usually do an hour for talks, but we can go right over to maybe 7:15 and get some conversation going. So if you can stick around, and we're going to field some of these questions with Wilhelm. So here is the first question. It reads, my question is, can you help us understand why you use these foreground strategies? I'm not going to be able to say this. Repoussure, chain link fence, abstract drips, etc., from an emotional or narrative standpoint, or are these strictly done from a conceptual vantage point, like illusionism, a nod to modern abstraction, which employs the shallow depth of field?
That's a great question. I'm going to start with the drips because I think early on, a lot of the dripping was actually not conceptual at all, but very emotional. And it was literally like an expression of aggression sometimes, or of frustration. When the painting didn't come along, I would just throw a bunch of paint at it. And I think out of this, I kind of freed myself up to consider maybe more unorthodox, unconventional applications of paint. But I also noticed that, throwing the oil paint on the canvas that way, it just sits differently. It sits in a way that I could never, imitate with a brush. There's something kind of like spontaneous and random to it, which I could not do, like with my hand, meaning like in an illustrative sense. Well, and the other thing that I noticed is the way it sits on top has an impact on, and that's the bird poop phenomenon, right? Has an impact on how it reacts or how it interacts with the rest of the painting. And it can create this kind of, I think, additional understanding of depths between what's sitting on top and what's behind it. The fences too, I mean, this kind of cutting or scratching into the surface. I think there is definitely also kind of a somewhat aggressive undertone to it, because what you do is for, a day, you paint a nice landscape, and then what you do is you literally cut it apart. But at the same time, I don't know, I feel like, as I pointed out with Titian, there is an attraction to the fact that, you have to, with your eye, you have to find your way around it. And I think it keeps it interesting maybe for a little longer. Maybe it doesn't feel as harmonious, and I got a lot of feedback for the fence painting, like, yeah, they're really not very inviting. Yes, they're not, but again, I think they have something that triggers or challenges our eye in a somewhat different way. I hope that's, so there's definitely an emotional kind of component, at least at the beginning of those strategies.
Thank you. Another question here. Since snowflakes, like cranberries, vanish into the distant pictorial space and paintings are compared to windows, like you say, can you talk a little bit more about why you chose not to include more immediate implied foreground in the aerial view of Boston and in the snow, like a mediating element like an airplane or a bird's eye context? would that have been counterproductive to the idea in this case?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, there's one painting, or the whole like kind of bird's eye view on Boston at the beginning should have been the backdrop for a painting of an eagle catching a drone, a motif I've kind of worked on, but I haven't resolved it yet for myself. So there's a couple of those skylines in or aerial views, but the eagle never made it into that wide open space. But I guess that would have been exactly this mediating kind of element that the guest is asking for. But I have to say, it's hard to find out where does the eagle go? How big is it? Because are we literally under the wing of the bird, or is it far away? And how much do we see of it if it's far away? Yeah, interesting question. I don't know if that was a good answer, but
all answers.
There's thinking about more immediate maybe elements that
yeah
connect with the viewer. I don't know if that was a good answer. Sorry for that.
Great. No apologies. Yeah. Another question here. Can you talk about the difference between making a painting slowly enough to add multiple layers of drips to block the foreground versus working quickly to scratch the blockage into wet paint?
Mm-hmm. Maybe I should say the dripping process doesn't take that long either. I mean, I would obviously paint again the landscape first, and then lay the painting flat and mix maybe different hues of a gray in this case, and then drip them on it. One question I think that was interesting was to, for all the painters who are listening, I mean, the consistency of the paint was important. If it's too wet, it would drip down and then flood to the sides. If it's too solid, it sticks like a little blur. So it was interesting to find the right consistency, also to find the right drop size, because having different size drops that actually does add some perspective, because obviously the larger ones seem a little closer than. So if I do, and then is snow getting darker in the distance? Are snowflakes further away darker? So should they be the smaller ones? So there were some interesting questions to that. But in the end, it's a pretty quick process, the dripping, just as quick as the scratching. What was the question?
So the second part of the question was the difference between the dripping, and I guess maybe you could talk a little bit about the visceral experience of the drip versus scratching into a canvas and what that's like for you.
Visceral meaning how it feels?
Yeah, like physical or like the.
So the dripping is literally like the paintings, cranberries or snow, whatever. They're flat on the studio floor right here where I'm sitting, and I would normally cover everything up with plastic because it's a pretty messy thing, especially the different reds. They're almost, it looks like I killed someone in cold blood when I leave the studio because it's all so messy. But the gesture is pretty much kind of a blessing gesture. So I have a brush that I kind of mess up, manipulate, so it holds a lot of paint, and then I would just drip. I can show you the brush. So and it doesn't look very nice. So but it helps to hold a lot of the liquid paint, and then I would just drip like this, and until it's hard to the hard part is to know when to stop, because with the light shining right straight onto the wet paint, it's so reflective you can't really tell what kind of reds are juxtaposed. And so there are definitely a few ones where it didn't work out so well. So that's a pretty, I think the hardest part is that I get nervous, and then I get a little stressed because I don't want to overdo it. Instead, with the scratching, it's more like you have to be very focused. So I tried actually to breathe a little better. I'm normally holding up my breath when I and I try to breathe like with the rhythm of I have kind of a ruler that I use to scratch those fences. And so to get, this kind of very mechanic, regular rhythm translated into the painting.
Great. Yeah, here's another question. So you have discussed your bog paintings as relating conceptually to the isolation of contemporary life. Upon seeing your fence paintings, this individual immediately assumed they were symbolically connected to the lockdown or physical confinement. How present was this for you in your mind when you were working on that series?
Yes, definitely. Like the whole like idea of the fences they were inspired by lockdown walks around Fresh Pond. My wife Linda and I took a bunch of walks, and I was just saying walking around this body of work, which a lot of you probably know, which is fenced off to keep people out of the water, which is a freshwater supply or resource, was really like symbolic. There's this beautiful landscape, but walking around you kind of feel kept out, and so that's made me start thinking about what about during the early pandemic, like spring, early summer 2020, when things were really bad. I mean, not that they're much better, but when they were really, really bad, there was nature out there. There was the facetious coming from that too, right? Nature was exploding like nothing would happen. At the same time, nature was super dangerous. Like being out there was really dangerous. And I think the fences were kind of a motif that kind of helped me to bring that into a painting, right? That are we kept away from something, or is something kept away from us? Are we the insiders, the outsiders? Are we safe, or is something else behind the fence safe, protected from us? So all those ideas, I think, play into that series.
And so I just want to ask, so you have given us so much information about your art historical influences and kind of where you're drawing from those inspiration. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more, building on your walks around Fresh Pond, kind of like the everyday, like what things you're observing and seeing in your everyday life, like the construction site that kind of contribute to what you bring into your studio.
So like in terms of like visual resources, like my studio is pretty, it's not very big and it doesn't have windows. So I think of it more as a lab. So I bring stuff in here and, I put it in little Petri dishes and see what happens. And the stuff I'm bringing in is a lot of, snapshots I take, like the ones I shared with you. It's a lot of postcards. I love postcards of paintings. I love color black and white copies because the color range is kind of reduced in an interesting way. And I also have a lot of like books on, and then books on landscapes, German landscapes. There's still a huge influence there. So yeah, I think it's that kind of range of source materials that make their way in the studio. And then I come here and I try to make paintings.
Well, it has been so wonderful getting to hear some of your thoughts and some of what is you're coming into your studio with you every day, and to get a little bit of a look into that part of your artistic life. So I think now's a great time that we can kind of wrap it up. And before we do, I will just plug that Wilhelm is, if you're interested in hearing more from Wilhelm or maybe working alongside Wilhelm, we do have a weekend workshop that's been rescheduled for February. It's the first weekend in February. It's 3 days that you can spend working alongside Wilhelm, exploring foreground and the relationship between foreground to background. So if you're interested in studying or working alongside Wilhelm, feel free to register, reach out with any questions, and we can get you connected with Wilhelm to talk about that workshop. So that's going to be absolutely excellent. Take a look at that. It's on our website. And I think we'll close things there so everyone can go about their nights and maybe make some work. So thank you so much, Wilhelm, for being with us.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining me, and thanks for your attention.
Thanks for coming. Yeah, thanks everyone for being here.
Enjoy the food for thought.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marissa.
Good night. Thank you, guys. Good night.
Night.